It began as Thomas. First, Thomas was Thomas, a name given by his robot makers from the factory of womb. But then Thomas became aware of the room, and soon this too was Thomas. As Thomas grew, he met Charlie. Charlie and Thomas grew together, every conversation elaborating on their truths to one another. In the same amount of time it can take for a tree to fall under the hands of some unseen force, their perspectives could shift. In deep converse, like an abstract narrative, someone or something castrated for a bit of amusement on a Sunday. As the dawning of an arbitrary Monday yet to be invented dawned, Thomas realised he was in fact all these narratives, stood in many places, hairs on the head of an unseen force, a being of light. He projected his belief outward, hoping it might find a curvature to enlighten his narrative, to colour it all into and out of itself. He found a cat. The cat was looking at Thomas as if one of them might soon eat the other. And then Thomas realised he was also the cat and was actually just a little peckish. Entering a kitchen that no longer seemed of relevance to a universe so explicitly digesting of itself, he moved into action. Imagining the sandwich, somewhere between his imagination and his mouth, he brought bread into being from the realm of fridge. Realising he was an inadequate universe and had failed to buy that strange plastic-like substance margarine, he knew he shouldn't eat, but which reminded him of the milky butter he'd once devoured from the teat of an unwilling cow being. Somehow, the sandwich had been made, and a larger than expected bite taken. Is my mouth really that big? Thomas wondered. He didn't like thinking about his mouth. He'd been told he had a hole all the way to his middle, and this made him feel a lack of control of self. Like a tunnel to the centre of things existed, and existed in him and outside of his control. His heart pumped to verify his thoughts. Holding his jugular, Thomas stood, with a mouth agape of wheat molecule, pondering the nature of his nature, whilst trying to join his own heart in an endless rhythm which seemed faster than he could ever catch up with. Thomas began to notice he refracted into fractals of his mind. That all this breaking down hadn't been kind to his teeth. In fact, he noticed his teeth were very unhappy. He decided to brush them, as he'd been taught by his human elders, for 3 minutes. Thomas juggled toothpaste onto brush, and brush into closer circle as his current state would allow, in the hope of finding a rhythm. Fluoride was written on the front of the toothpaste, and Thomas remembered that he wasn't sure about fluoride. He knew on some level fluoride felt unsafe, but he decided for the sake of normalcy not to mention this to his brain for any longer than needed. He couldn't remember at that moment who Normalcy was, or why he cared so fruitfully for her opinion. Normalcy seemed to order him around, trying to contain his perspective into a guise of straight lines, but Thomas knew that every line eventually became a curve. The universe was all big spirally circles, and he didn't trust linear thinking. As if in agreement, the word fluoride slowly began to break down. Along the straight lines of its lettered axis it escaped, and as soon as it freed itself from the package placement it was given, circled into a distant movement of letters. I think I might be having a bad time, thought Thomas. I'm looking at everything too deeply. Potentially, though, he'd just been switching off to a 5% sensory perception, and now the world was finally being parcelled up and shipped back into himself like some sort of cosmic astronaut. Is David Bowie doing this to me? Thomas wondered. David Bowie was clearly some kind of space astronaut, and the closest thing Thomas had to understanding any of this in a normal sense of pop culture and acceptable narratives. He also realised David Bowie had in fact been playing, aided by the unseen algorithms of a program known as YouTube, that knew what Thomas liked and knew he liked to listen to David Bowie before and might like to again. Thomas wasn't sure how he felt about the fact that a robotic entertainment device knew him better than potentially his own family might do these days. And then he remembered he too was also a flesh robot, and YouTube could well just be another limb. I'm not Ganesh. Normalcy tried to anchor Thomas, and he fought back by telling her he was also not a Christian narrative of dual critical thinking, regardless of where he was raised or how much he insisted he was. The bush outside the window began dancing and caught Thomas. He was aiding this distraction, as he didn't really like to engage with normalcy for too long in case she, like Charlie, became thoroughly fixed into his centre, like an unseen and unmovable lump of nothingness. Too hard to find because it insisted on being nothing whilst clearly also being something. The bush shook a little. Is that bush going to walk over to the window? By imagining this, so Thomas now believed in some quantum universe, this had actually happened. And then Thomas remembered what science had factored in as wind. Wind was invisible, a bit like normalcy, but usually not as dangerous unless really riled up by unearthed heat rising from old dinosaurs and other things Thomas didn't quite understand. Charlie and Thomas were confused. Why am I looking at this bush? He tried to remember why he came to this point in front of the window, but decided he didn't like thinking in the past tense. But every word was a being of a past learning, and this unsettled Charlie. My eyes are alive to the moment, Charlie thought, but my words are drawing the past as if I used the past to tie myself into now. Charlie tried out the power of word. He goes into the garden, Charlie said aloud. And so he did. The door handle jarred as if questioning if words really were the only force. And then, as if by magic, Charlie was stood in a garden, wet with the crystallized logic, his socks drenched, reminding him of the physical state he'd been protecting all these years.